I mean, if you want to say who are the 11 potential nominees that the CSIS had kind of mentioned, I could pretty much guess who they are. Yeah. So it's an open secret that both Mr. Tohti and I have been living with and knowing, who's who. And that's why, after so many years, it's no longer a surprise to us that the recent CSIS report has come out with this explosive intelligence, if you will.
It was mentioned in
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
My first question is for you, Mr. Tohti. What does the communist regime in Beijing do to the Uyghur people in Canada, and why do they do that?
The communist regime in Beijing is not democratically elected regime. That regime is not accountable for its people. It acts like a criminal organization. For that regime, it is important to keep the Uyghurs and other people under their control, and for that reason, they take a hostage of our family members. I'm speaking on behalf of Uyghur Canadians, and just to control our life here in Canada. And even the democratic and free country in Canada we are living, and Uyghur Canadians are not free just because of the Chinese pressure and the Chinese threat by taking hostage of their family members. Basically, they don't want the Uyghur Canadians to exercise their right to protest and exercise their right to speak about the atrocity crimes that Chinese Communist Party is committing. And that is the biggest threat for the Chinese government, and for that reason, it is regarded, these kind of peaceful activities, as part of national security, and for that reason, they apply all harsh measures to crack down.
Thank you. Mr. Kwan, you have talked about some of the coercion that Beijing uses. Can you share some of the examples, or an example of how the communist regime in Beijing attempts to coerce and intimidate Chinese Canadians?
I can share with you many incidents, but I believe just to illustrate the kind of strong arm of the law, if you were, of the Chinese here in Canada, and the kind of subtle way that they can do this with sort of exerting fear on the Chinese Canadian community is a very typical example of you get a phone call, not only just in the middle of the night, but you get a phone call in the middle of the day asking, "So, how are your parents doing back in Sichuan, China?" And then you get the message. That means if you don't behave, your parents' phone numbers, address, or even their physical well-being is under threat. So in that sense, it's a very subtle threat, and they've used this on many Chinese Canadians. I'm sure they have done this to Mr. Tohti as well. So this is something that I can vouch for. I will tell you a very innocuous kind of way that they did to me. I was traveling to Hong Kong for a cultural event. I'm a filmmaker. I went to a film festival in Hong Kong to present my film, and I was followed in Hong Kong back in 2005. And I was questioned during the Q&A period by what I seemed to be an agent of the Chinese Communist regime. And these are little things that they know. You know that I know that you know that I'm watching you. So that's the kind of thing that they exert pressure on you.
Thank you. You have talked about observations that you suspected, or you've spoken to media about suspected interference by the regime in Beijing in the electoral process in Canada, specifically federal nominations. I believe in one instance you were talking about busloads of people who had been sent to a nomination as arranged by agents of Beijing operating in Canada. With about a minute, if you could tell us about that.
Standard modus operandi. Chinese consulate may not do it directly. They have their proxies as a wink-wink thing. They have business people arranging for buses and paying stipends, something like $20 or $50 a day, to bus in people either to nomination meetings or to do counter-protesting. And we have seen this in one of the fights at the Toronto District School Board, where they bus in international students from Waterloo, from Guelph, into Toronto to do this kind of thing. And this is something that I've seen firsthand, and this is something that I've been told firsthand by many other writings as well.
Both Mr. Toti, Mr. Kwan, as well as our guest from the Monk School. I think I'm going to start with you, Mr. Kwan, if I could. You talked about how the United Front Workers Party, UFWD, have come together to engage in astroturfing. Could you give me an example? Can you give us an example of a recent example, if you could, of astroturfing?
The astroturfing during the head tax redress fight, in which Chinese Canadian community asked the government to pay reparation and apologize for the Chinese Exclusion Act and its head tax. This was a campaign that was carried out by over 20 years before that by people in the Chinese Canadian community. And I represented one of the organizations, the main organization at that time, to lead on this fight. But as I mentioned, right after the Tiananmen Square, Chinese set up an umbrella organization called the NCCC, National Congress of Chinese Canadians. They usurped the issue by themselves, in which they have no connection to. These are recent Chinese immigrants that have nothing to do with Chinese Exclusion Act. And yet they took the topic up. They issued press releases. They formed over 300 proxy organizations registered with Corporate Canada, in which they share directors and have one perhaps share the same postal addresses and so forth. So these are what is examples of astroturfing. They set up these fake organizations, issue press releases, and have press conferences.
So I'm glad that you keep track of, and your organization keeps track of examples of foreign interference. Is it? I don't need you to get into detail about it today, but would you feel comfortable with providing the committee with examples of these organizations that you feel are acting?
It would be my pleasure to do that.
That would be great. And when you track those organizations, you also track the members of the boards of directors of these organizations or the leadership of?
Yes.
Would you be comfortable sharing that with us as well?
It's been so long. I certainly will try my best. Yeah.
Okay. So that's an interesting question. Are there recent examples that your organization tracks?
Not our organization, but certainly I can get to the information if you would like.
That would be very helpful.
These are basically public records. One of the things I want to talk about is I speak the language, I live the culture, and I understand the modus operandi of these, both the Chinese Communist Party as well as many of its proxies. So we are, in a sense, on the ground, and we pretty much know who's who. I mean, if you want to say who are the 11 potential in the culture, and I understand the modus operandi of these, both the Chinese Communist Party as well as many of its proxies. So we are, in a sense, on the ground, and we pretty much know who's who. I mean, if you want to say who are the 11 potential nominees that the CSIS had kind of mentioned, I could pretty much guess who they are. So it's an open secret that both Mr. Toti and I have been living with and knowing, who's who. And that's why, after so many years, it's no longer a surprise to us that the recent CSIS report has come out with this explosive intelligence, if you will.
It was mentioned in various testimonies, and I think this question will go to our guest from the Monk School, of the Australian model of the foreign agent registry. Would you happen to have you done research on this and as to its effectiveness and what are the things that we should be adapting to a Canadian context and what things we shouldn't be adapting to a Canadian context?
Yeah, for sure. So I haven't researched specifically the Australian Foreign Agents Registry. My sense, though, is Canada could set one up. How effective it will be,
And let me start by saying a big thank you to the witnesses for your bravery, for coming today, and your continued advocacy and speaking out about these and all of the associated issues. To Mr. Toti, can you expand a little bit as to how Uyghurs who live in Canada have faced pressure and influence and threats and intimidation by the communist dictatorship in Beijing? Could you expand a little bit on what that's looked like and some personal experience or those who you know?
Thank you. It is a long list, and we have been just passing this information to our government officials since early 2000. For example, I'm a Canadian citizen, but I'm Uyghur Canadian, and you are also a Canadian citizen and are holding the same passport. And if the one Uyghur Canadian and another Canadian citizen just go to Chinese the consulate to get a Chinese visa, and you get totally different the forms and the procedures, and the Uyghur Canadians goes totally different, and they will ask, for example, how you remain in Canada, whether you applied asylum or not, and you have to receive invitation from your parents, and your relatives, and all of them, they have to have a security clearance. There's so many things, and also you have to sign the pledge to loyalty to Chinese Communist Party if you are Uyghur Canadian. And for example, and that also effectively isolate the Uyghur Canadian from their family members and creates that kind of fear. Okay, if I go to protest, here's the consequence. And I may not see my parents again, or I cannot invite my parents to come to see me because passport is given by the government. And the Uyghur Canadians are subject to totally set of rule by the Chinese government, not only in China, here in Canada as well. For that reason, just regular phone call, just threaten them not to participate in any protest. That is very standard. But it goes much further, to be informant for Chinese government and report whatever happened in Canada. And then don't go anything that against the interests of Chinese, the Communist Party.
Thank you very much for this, and I know that time is limited. So if there are further examples or stories that you have, please feel free to follow up with this committee. And certainly, I think that what you've shared today behooves us to take this seriously, and I appreciate that, Mr. Kwan. You've talked about some of the examples of how the communist dictatorship in Beijing puts pressure on Canadians and Canadian democratic infrastructure. How commonly known was this prior to some of these recent revelations? Can you expand as to how well known it was amongst yourself and others within the Chinese diaspora in this country?
Very commonly known. In fact, we've been saying all along for the last 15, 20 years. And we've seen a lot of this on the ground, obviously. And many of these have not been reported, or if they were reported to the local police or the RCMP, they will not be handled because they're of lack of evidence. That's why in 2017, many of us band together and collect evidences and testimonies in which we've produced the harassment and intimidation report together with Amnesty International and submitted it to the relevant government departments.
So just in the time that I have left, if we have all this evidence, why do you think there has been a hesitancy or a refusal to act on behalf of the government?
I'm not sure. We have not gotten any acknowledgement so far.
Wow.
You know, normally you write a letter to the MP or to the minister, you get at least acknowledgement saying, we received your letter, we'll pass it on to somebody else. We did not even get these letters.
Can I ask who you sent this information to?
Well, first of all, we sent it to through the GAC, and then, of course, to RCMPs. And RCMP is primarily the one that we are trying to deal with.
Were there any ministers that you had sent to?
I believe we have copied to some ministers. I'm not even, I don't remember who exactly was.
Okay.
Was copied.
Would you be able to send us that information? Would that be possible?
If I can find it, yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Keurig. Next, we're...
Mr. Kwan, I kind of want to go back to something that you mentioned about Markham Unionville, and I want to say that I'm not the least bit surprised that Paul Chang won that election. He was a police officer in the region for 28 years. He speaks 8 languages, and he's been an excellent member of parliament for the last 2 years, so I just wanted to put that on the record.